Hello, friends. Good morning. Today, as you know, we are going to be reading about the French and Indian War. And as you can see on your work doc, your learning target, you can explain the causes and the results of the French and Indian War. So basically, what made it happen, and then what happened afterwards. So what were the results? Who won? What changed? Okay. So you're focusing on what caused the war, this war, and then what were the results? What happened afterwards? Who won? What did they win? What changed? Okay. We've already gone through the connection when you talk about if you had an argument or disagreement with someone that you know and you've both claimed something as yours. We went through the language. I'll put it again. George Washington, not the president yet. He's a army. It says a army lieutenant. He's an army lieutenant, meaning he was one of the leaders of the colonist army, the 13 colonies which were part of England. Okay, and a dispute is a conflict or a problem. King George III is the King of England. And the proclamation of 1763, proclamation is based on the word proclaim, which means to tell or state something. So basically, it was they wrote something and they told about what the results were from the war. So they made a proclamation and they said, we proclaim since the war's over that so and so wins this and so loses that. So we're going down now through. Text-dependent questions. I'm going to read this, and then we're going to model these quick text-dependent questions. Text-dependent means you depend on something. You depend on the text to answer this. You cannot just use background knowledge. So I'm going to read this. Read aloud. George Washington, a 21-year-old lieutenant, looked over his troops. British and Virginian soldiers in red and blue coats marched stiffly in neat rows. Washington was worried. The troops made an easy target. The enemy did not march in neat rows or wear bright uniforms. Scattered through the forest, the enemy was hard to find. I'm stopping and thinking and noticing that he's noticing his own soldiers were making an easy target. They wore bright clothes, not camouflage, and they marched in rows. They weren't hiding. They weren't seeking shelter. They weren't like taking cover. Now it goes to the big picture. The enemy George Washington worried about was the French. So if we remember from last week, the French had taken over a significant amount of land in North America. We looked at this last week. You can see on your map, the French had claimed a lot of land and they called it New France, and they were into trading for furs and trying to get wealthy that way. As you read in Chapter 9, the British colonies in North America were growing. By the 1750s, nearly 2 million colonists lived there. But France found it hard to get colonists to come. Only about 60,000 French colonists lived in New France. Trouble began when British colonists moved into lands claimed by the French. In 1754, the French and Indian War began. It got its name from the people that the British colonists were fighting, the French and Native Americans who joined them. This is right from your book, and I'm going to need this to answer some text-dependent questions. So it says on here, why did England fight several wars with France? So I need to look back to find this. My strategy is looking back. And it says up in the top paragraph, England fought several wars with France over control of Europe. Oh, they were fighting over control of Europe. So I'm going to put a little sentence. The text states that England and France had several wars and fought for control over Europe. So the reading is telling us that they were rivals back in their old continent where they were from. They were rivals. And this was coming to their new world, which wasn't really new, and fighting here. Question. Based on paragraph 2, how did the populations of the 13 colonies differ from the population of New France? So this tells me the 13 colonies, I need to look back. Nearly 2 million colonists, but France found it hard to get colonists to come. Only about 60,000 French colonists lived in New France. So 2 million, I keep looking back. So I'm going to start with the same sentence starter. Based on paragraph 2, the English, I'm saying the population. The population of the English colonies was about 2 million people. Whereas the population of New France was around 60,000 people. So there were way more people in the colonies than in New France. Even though New France took a lot of land size, there was way more people in the colonies. According to the text, when did the French and Indian War begin and how did it get its name? So back here it says, 1754, the French and Indian War began. It got its name from the people that the British colonists were fighting, the French and Native Americans who joined them. So it wasn't the French against the Indians, or meaning the Native Americans, but that's who the British were fighting. So it says, according to the text, the French and Indian War began in 1754, and it got its name from the people that the British were fighting, comma, the French and Native Americans, which in this case they use the word Indian in the book. Those are text-dependent questions. Notice every single one I had to look back. Okay, so we're going to be going into more of your reading in a moment. I like to use, if you look down at the bottom here, these strategies. Here's the map you're going to see. Here's some pro tips from last week. Strategies. You can use split screen if you'd like to. You can make a plan to know what to look for. You can pause and re-watch things and write down the important information. Re-watch things if you're confused. Look back and self-check and judge yourself to see if you picked the most important information related to your plan. So your plan is usually looking at the questions and you know what you're looking for, and make sure you find the most important information. So you're going to be finding, based on this section called the Ohio River Valley, what was the conflict between the French and British colonists? So basically, why were they fighting? There were these two forts. And I'm going to go through and read these as we go. Okay, so I'm noticing that little pattern. So here goes our reading. We are starting on page 273, and there's no page number on that page, but it starts with the Ohio River Valley. So I know from my doc, I'm looking at it, we're looking for information. What was the conflict between the French and the British colonists? The Ohio River Valley lies mostly in what is now the middle western region of the United States. Both Britain and France claimed the land in this valley. Until the middle of the 1700s, the Native Americans living there had kept out both groups of settlers. Then disputes among themselves and with the colonists led some Native Americans in the valley to sell their land to the British colonists. To protect their fur trade, the French began building forts against the British. So basically they're saying both Britain, which means like part of England, and France were claiming the same land. And the Native Americans were there first, and they really weren't sure which side to take. Okay, oops. How did that happen? So now back to our doc. Next, we're going to be looking to the next section. This is according to this section called Fort Duquesne and Fort Necessity. What event was the beginning of the war? And then what happened to George Washington, his troops? Maybe connect this. Fort Duquesne and Fort Necessity. The British wanted to force the French to leave the Ohio River Valley. So the British were like, we want to get France out of here. The French had built Fort Duquesne where today is the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's where it stands. The British colony of Virginia also claimed the valley. So Britain and France both want this land. In 1754, the British sent for Washington, meaning they sent for George Washington. He was a leader. They wanted him to bring soldiers. When he arrived, his troops attacked and defeated a small force of French soldiers in the woods near the fort. This battle began the French and Indian War. So when he showed up, they attacked the French, and then a war started. Washington's troops quickly built a temporary fort out of logs, and they called it Fort Necessity. Soon, a larger French army attacked it, and they defeated George Washington's men. So George Washington and his soldiers started the war, built a fort, then they got attacked back, and they were defeated. More stuff's going down. But let's go back to our notes. So you're going to answer these questions. According to the section for number 3, called General Braddock's Defeat, what lesson did George Washington learn? So there's a general named General Braddock, and something happens, and George Washington's going to learn a lesson. In 1755, the British tried again to capture Fort Duquesne. General Edward Braddock led the troops. They were well trained. Braddock thought they would win the battle. Yet, as the British neared the fort, the bullets seemed to come from out of nowhere. Braddock's troops broke and ran as sheep pursued by dogs, Washington wrote. Braddock died 4 days later from his wounds. So Braddock thought they were going to win easy, and they were getting attacked. They didn't know where bullets were coming from, and Washington noted that they basically got whooped, and they were running away like they had no chance. Washington learned an important lesson from Braddock's defeat. The French were using Native American methods of warfare, the book is saying. They made surprise attacks on the British from behind trees, large rocks, anywhere they could hide. The British and colonial soldiers' brightly colored jackets made easy targets. So George Washington, and there's a picture of him, young lieutenant, became the first president eventually. They were noticing that they were fighting with common sense. They weren't wearing bright red clothes. They were hiding and having sneak attacks. They weren't just marching up, starting a fight. So George Washington learned a lesson. This is going to come in important. So now you're answering number 3. Number 4 goes to the next section, and you're looking for why did the Iroquois join the British side? So that is, Iroquois is a group of Native Americans. So back to the text. It says the tide turns, meaning things change. Because British colonists greatly outnumbered them, French colonists had welcomed the Hurons' help, so another group of Native Americans. So remember, there weren't as many French people, and they were like, hey, we need some help. So they welcomed the Huron, who was a group of Native Americans, to help them. Washington saw what valuable partners Native Americans could be. So the British decided to ask the Iroquois for help. So George Washington was like, they're getting some good help. We need to get some help too. The Iroquois were not eager to take sides with the British. British colonists had taken much Iroquois land. You have disregarded us, said Tioughnioga, a Mohawk leader. Still, the Iroquois joined the British against their old enemies, the Huron and the French. In return, the British would keep colonists away from Iroquois lands. So the Iroquois basically joined the British side. They didn't really want to, but they did because they were enemies with the Huron and the French. Now we see what happens. Britain wins the war. The French won victory after victory over the British until 1758. So this is saying the French were beating the British. Then Britain brought new equipment and sent more troops and its best generals to the colonies. These resources helped Britain win the war. So eventually this is saying Britain won the war. They weren't winning at first, but they won. In 1762, France gave Spain much of Louisiana to keep it out of Britain's hands. Included was the city of New Orleans, an important port in the French fur trade. So, let's see here. This is saying France gave Spain much of their land to keep it out of Britain's hands. So French was like, hey, we don't want Britain. We hate them so much. We're going to give our land to you, Spain, because we hate the British more than you guys. In 1763, Britain and France signed the Treaty of Paris, ending the French and Indian War. So this is in 1763. They agreed the war was over and they signed a peace treaty. As you can see from the maps on page 274, Great Britain gained almost all of France's land in North America. Because Spain had sided with France in the war, Britain also got the Spanish colony of Florida. So this is showing this map. This is pretty neat. You look at before the war started, notice the colors. Look at all the pink. That was all New France, all the way up in here. Okay, and Spain had all this land in green, and the colonies were small, this purple area, and they had some up here. Now look after the war. Look what happens. Notice the pink is gone, except one place down here that many of you should know, Haiti. But look, Britain went from having the 13 colonies to look all of this land they claimed. And of course, this was Native Americans' land. But these 3 European countries were fighting over who could take the land. So now you see British, all this purple, Spain controlling all this, and they gave up Florida. Notice Florida went from green to purple. And then some of this yellow was no one, they hadn't settled on it yet. But this is the big difference. So just 13 years later, things change. And this is going to lead to another war soon. We'll read more about that. 2 wars, actually. Pontiac's Rebellion. After the war, British colonists again began moving west to the Ohio River Valley. An Ottawa chief named Pontiac called on Native Americans there to drive off your land those who will do you nothing but harm. So this Native American chief was like, hey, we need to get rid of the British. They're taking our land. They're doing us no good. We need to join together and fight against them. Pontiac then asked the Native Americans of the Ohio Valley to unite against the British. In 1763, they captured and burned British settlements, but the British army soon defeated them. So this chief, Pontiac, got many Native Americans to fight against the British, and they beat the British a little bit, but it didn't last. This is almost the end of the chapter, or the page, this section. Why it matters. Pontiac's rebellion, so this war with the Native Americans fighting against the British, it made King George III realize that protecting the colonists would be costly. So King George, way back across the ocean, is like, oh wow, it's going to cost a lot of money, a lot of resources to protect the colonies. So he's like, even though this is way across the ocean, we still need to protect it, but it's not going to be easy. He, down here it says he then issued the Proclamation of 1763. So he's like, I proclaim, blah, blah, blah. He's going to talk about what happens now. This proclamation, or official announcement, gave the colonists all land east of the Appalachian Mountains. It set aside lands west of the mountains for Native Americans as their hunting grounds. Now Britain controlled the fur trade. So I'm going to show this. The Appalachian Mountains are in here. And he said basically, this map doesn't show up, but the Appalachian Mountains are basically in here. He said, colonists, you can have this side. Native Americans, you can take this side. However, the colonists aren't going to like this. The colonists did not like being closed off from the western lands in the fur trade. They were also beginning to dislike British rule. So this is a little preview. The colonists were like, hey, you can't tell us that we only have to live here. We want to spread out. We want to take more land. We want to try to make more money. And King George was like, no, we're going to leave this for the Native Americans and you get this side. And the colonists were like, don't tell us what to do or what not to do. This is going to end up leading to another war, but that's for another day. Now back to your work doc. Back to your questions. As you're working, remember, thinking about which of these strategies, way down at the bottom, have you been using? Have you been splitting the screen? Were you making a plan? You pause and rewatch. Are you making sure you have the most important information? Okay. And when you're done answering the questions, you're going to go to the paragraph. And there's no choice, but you're looking at these 2 maps and you're going to explain basically what are the differences in the maps. So like what happened? And this connects back to your learning target of explaining the results. This map shows the results basically of the war. what happened, how the land changed, or who changed over, who was claiming the land. You're writing a strong paragraph, and then there's a final reflection to answer from this chart. Which strategies did you use today? Which strategy was most helpful to you and why? And which strategy you think you could do better at using? Okay. And you pick 2 of the questions. You can skip one, but answer 2 of them. All right. Good luck. Continue that hard work.